All right, folks, we're back at it today here in the Gospel of John. Today we're going to move past the prologue of John, that's the opening verses, and we're going to start getting into the narrative, which is the story. And this story begins with John the Baptist and his testimony about Jesus. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk specifically about the concept of testimony. Why is it so powerful? And why is testimony, the majority of the time, like 99% of the time, testimony is what moves the soul? And so in the Bible itself, if we just look at the Bible and say, what is the Bible? Well, the Bible is a book of testimony. The Bible testifies, the Bible writers are writing a testimony to God working in the world. The Bible is not a systematic theology. The Bible does not try to describe God in Himself, but we do find the actions of God in our world. So the Bible is a book of God's acts being revealed to us as He acted in history. Very important, because no other God has done that. God acts in history, and He's got a telos, He's got an endpoint. And the Bible writers are writing down the testimony of God's acts in history. So that's why testimony itself is very powerful, and more powerful, as we'll see, than simply facts or proofs or anything like that. So today our background picture is another one that I've had generated by AI, partly because it's just kind of cool to do. But this is John the Baptist testifying to the crowds. And again, I kind of like the style of Eastern Orthodox and the icons. So this is John, and this is John the Baptist, and this is in John chapter 1, and his testimony that Jesus is in fact the Lamb of God. Okay, so let's go then. We think about testimony, and this is very important, because God calls us to testify. And we're testifying about our experience with God and His actions, whether it's saving actions, redeeming actions that happen in our lives. Just like the Bible, just like the Bible's testifying to historical action of God's work, we testify to the historical action of God's works. Now, doesn't mean we can prove anything, and God does not call us to prove anything. We're called to testify. Because testimony, when testimony is authentic and when it's heartfelt, the human being on the other side, that person standing in front of you that you're giving your testimony to, when it's heartfelt, and I mean authentic and heartfelt, meaning this really happened to me. I was this way and now I'm that way. The other person can sense it in their soul, and that's what will move the soul. You might not be able to see it in the moment, but this is what almost always moves the soul. Okay? So we're going to be talking testimony, but as we start out today, I want to offer just a general comment on the Gospel of John and what we've done. The Gospel of John it's tightly worded. It is a dense piece of work. And each verse carries a significant weight. And you can think about the fact that John, if he's walking with Jesus around 30 AD, but he's not writing his gospel letter until the 90s of that first century. That's 60 years of working these stories out, telling them and retelling them and telling them and retelling them, and then putting that into writing in a way that he has to do it in a very short span of space. So what he does is he makes it very deep. And that's one of the problems we have with reading an ancient document like this, is he's working vertically because he doesn't have a lot of horizontal space to write based on the size of the scrolls. So when he writes, he's communicating with dense information that takes the what he's saying deeper. So, you know, when you read John, it can be slow. There's a lot to digest. If you pick up a commentary on John, which there are thousands, they can be quite detailed and extensive. Lots of information for us to process if we're going to actually figure out at the deepest level that we can what John is saying. So as I'm going through the study, I have to find a balance. And that balance is between too much detail or not enough detail. So I want to be able to point out the things that I think will provide the most insight. And I'm having to leave a lot on the cutting room floor. At some point, you'll have to go back and pick those up by yourself, and I trust God's going to lead you to those details when and if you need them. But when we study John, as with any book of the Bible, it's meant to be read repeatedly. And so repetition, there's an old saying, repetition is the mother of learning. That's how we learn. Now, we learn a lot of things. We don't even realize we're learning them. But if you want to do it intentionally, it's repetition. So the more that you read and reread, you'll begin to see deeper into what John is trying to communicate. And what I think is a good way to do it is, let's say you read some of John, and then you go, whether it's a lesson here at Fig Tree Ministries or a lesson somewhere else, or you pick up an article or a commentary. So you've read John, you have some familiarity with it, but then you go listen to a teaching about it. Oh, and now it raises your level of awareness. And when you go back to read again, and of course, we see this all the time. If you go to any class at a church on a book of the Bible that has any detail to it, people are always having these, oh, I had no idea that was in there, because there's so many details to the Bible. So we want to get to the detail, but you also have to be reading repeatedly. And, when you start doing that, when you're reading repeatedly, and then you listen even a couple times, because you'll listen to this once, it's like watching a movie once, then you watch it again, you see things you didn't see the first time. So that's why it's important to both read and listen to teachings at the multiple times, because you will be able to go deeper yourself. And so that's the idea. You read, repetition, you then begin to see these underlying themes and structures that we're talking about here in the teaching, and then that will help you see deeper into what John is actually saying. So one thing that we've done, or that I've tried to do, because I think it's important for you to understand, is pick up on the many structures or themes that are happening throughout the Gospel of John. And when we see these themes or structures, it feeds into the overall message that John is trying to communicate. The more you read, the more familiar you are with John, the more the structures jump out at you. And so the first one we've talked about, and this is important, is that its creation is being revisited. It's as if the world is being born again, created anew. And so what we see is this structure. John starts the book with, in the beginning, an obvious reference to Genesis. Then he starts with a list of signs. Now, at first, he's telling us this is the first sign, this is the second sign. But then he's going to eventually stop telling you that, but he knows his audience is going to keep counting. 3, 4, 5. You get to the sixth sign, and just like on day 6 of Genesis, where God is creating a human being out of the earth, that's where he makes Adam, what's happening? We've got a human being coming out of the earth. Now, all of that, of course, is leading up to the 7th day of creation, and that's where God's glory rests. But here, it's paradoxical, because the 7th sign is the crucifixion. This is the pinnacle of God's glory. And you say, well, wait a minute, how does that work? How's that the pinnacle? But it's a paradox, so it takes a little initiation to understand the significance of love, of sacrificial love, of laying down one's life of how God would sacrifice his life for us. So there's all this glory wrapped up into that. And what John is saying, the world might say that, hey, glory is shining power, right? That's why the kings are all bedazzled when they show up to their formal. They have gold and jewels and all of that because they want to look shining power. It makes them look more powerful. God's saying the most powerful thing in the cosmos is love. And it's not always going to show up on the way that you think. But there's your creation story. And then it goes to chapter 20. And what do we see? On the first day of the week, just like the next day, there's the resurrection. Creation has been renewed. The first Adam, Genesis 1, or 1, 2, and 3, the first Adam failed. The last Adam, that's Jesus in the garden, he didn't fail. And now creation has been renewed. So, very intentional what John is doing. Well, that's good for us to know because that helps us read the Bible. Okay, or read the Gospel of John. Second one I pointed out is he's also showing us what we could call the mystical path to God. Now, this isn't being saved. It's what happens after you're saved. It's when you say yes to God, well, now that starts you down a whole nother path. Okay? And so we talked about this. It's from a book called The Mystical Way. The author's last name is Countryman. John is showing us through the disciples, through this, the way that he narrates his gospel writing, he's showing you a path that ultimately ends up with abiding in him. That's the union with God. So you have these moments of initial enlightenment. I think we found the Messiah that Moses talked about. It's this initial enlightenment, but it's not full on understanding yet. There's some level of baptism where you enter into the death and the life renewal that happens as we die to our old self and become born again or born from above. You realize then there's a food for your soul that comes through the Christ. We have a continued enlightenment. We discover that there's new life in all of this. And what he wants us to move towards is that abiding. And that doesn't just mean, well, I continue to go to church and I believe in God. It means that your soul is becoming so close to God that you're hearing God more clearly, which can happen as you do spiritual practices. You hear God more clearly. You recognize the path that you should be on. There's always extra forgiveness when you go off the path, because we all do. But this is a prominent theme because it's going to help us understand our own walk with God as we're working towards abiding in God. Okay, and then the last one we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the power of testimony. Because it's testimony that moves the soul. And this is such an important theme within John, because there's real power in testimony, and we all need to be able to craft our own testimony. The Bible, as I mentioned, is a book testifying to the actions of God. And the book of John is a testimony itself. He's giving a testimony to the people of his day. In fact, John tells us the purpose of his writing. This is important. I haven't done this yet in this study. But if you go to John, it's chapter 20, so it's right at the end. I mean, this is where, well, there's debate. There's debate about chapter 21, because it looks like it was tacked on like an appendix. John 20, verse 31, is like the end of what would seem to be John's writing. And then you have this second part, John 21, that shows up. But the point is, he tells us what's the purpose, right? He says, but these are written that you may believe. Now, the believe here, we have a Western mindset. It's like an intellectual assent. I went from not believing in God to I believe now in God. But believe here is much deeper. Believe in this case is that your whole being is moved. And because I believe, I act. So it's not just a intellectual, it's now what's going to follow are all of my actions. My path changes. And that includes trust, reliability, and confidence that Jesus is the Messiah, right? So it says, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, or that's Messiah, the Son of God. But then he's going to add this, and that believing, again, through that trust, through that confidence, through the practice of believing, that means you're living out the truth that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, that you have life in his name. So it's not just, hey, I got saved and now I have life. It's like, no, the life comes through your trust and confidence, you're believing in and living out that truth. That brings life in a way that if you follow the path of the world, brings death, okay? So life comes through living out your belief. Now, important here, is he talking about some random point in the future when you die? No, he's not talking about getting into heaven. He's not talking about like some kind of eternal life in heaven. He's talking about right now, your life today. Because, one of the things about John's community in Ephesus, there in the first century, is they had never seen Jesus, right? They can't experience Jesus face to face. But John is saying, you can rely on the testimony of others, and you can trust and believe that they are true and reliable. In fact, just prior to this verse, which is 31, you go back 2 verses to John 20:29, and he says this, Jesus says to him, because you have seen me, you believed. But blessed are those who have not seen me and have believed. That's John's community. They don't know Jesus. What they know is the testimony of others. That's the Gospel of John. Now, when they're offering proof in the context, what's happening, for instance, they go to a town in Greece called Berea, and we say you should be like the Bereans, but what you're saying to be like the Bereans, Paul goes to Berea and he goes to the synagogue. And now he's discussing with the Jews who are in the synagogue, and they have all of their holy scriptures. And what he's doing is making an argument that Jesus is the Messiah that God intended to send. And he's pulling out of the text. So if you're in a religious debate, you can do things like that, like proof text stuff. That's what Paul's doing there, but it's because the people already have a context for God, their Bible. When you're in a Greek setting where there is no context for Bible, when they don't care about your Bible, and they don't care about God, now you have to move. You can't have the same argument, okay? So this is the theme we're going to talk about today. It's testimony. And the reason it's important is that testimony, the personal testimony, how did God work in your life? It speaks to the soul of another human being in a way that offering a proof or an apologetic or a sharply worded argument does not. And one thing about the Bible is God never calls you to prove. He doesn't call us to be apologists. He says, go offer your testimony. Speak about what I've done in your life. So proof speaks to the intellect, and the intellect may never get down to the heart level. But testimony speaks to the soul. That's at the heart level, and that can easily, once the heart is moved, the mind will come along. That's the way it works. Right? And here in the West, I'm speaking from the United States, so here in the West, we are descendants of Greek thought, Greek logic, Greek reason. We want everything systematized and in perfect order. But that's not the Bible, because the Bible's Eastern. The Bible's not a Greek document. That's why people would love the Bible to have all these explainers in them instead of just stories that we go, well, no, what does that mean? Right? The Bible offers a story. The story is a testimony of the actions of God throughout history. And the story penetrates your soul in ways that we just don't understand. And so you get something like, I was blind, but now I see. That's just simple testimony. And if you go up and say, well, how does that work? Well, I don't know. I just know that I was blind and now I see. And so as we explore this idea of testimony in John, that we're going to see right at the beginning of the book, it starts out with John the Baptist and his testimony, and then it's going to flow through the remainder of the book, okay? So we start out John 1, verses 6 through 8. So as John is crafting his prologue, the opening to his letter, he inserts this about John the Baptist, okay? So we want to notice some things about what John is telling us, because this is going to be part of the theme, okay? So we notice, it says this, there came a man sent from God whose name was John, okay? This is important, because John is a prophet. He's a prophet of God. Where does John get his testimony about Jesus? Well, he's receiving from God himself. In fact, towards the end of chapter 1, he tells us that. Okay, so he is God's the originator of this whole story. He then sends John as a prophet, okay? And then it says this, that's John, he came as a witness to testify about the light. Now, he came as a witness to testify. Now, those sound completely different in English, but they're derived from the same Greek word. So you would have some repetition going on there. It would stand out. That's my point. We don't see it. It doesn't stand out in the English. He came as a witness to testify about the light, that all may believe through him. Now, that you might believe, that sounds very similar to what John is telling you is the whole purpose of his gospel. If we go back to that verse in chapter 20, verse 31. All of this is written down so that you might believe, and that through your belief you have life. So the goal of the testimony is to believe through John. Now here's what's key. It says he was not the light, and this is very important to notice. The gospel writers are very careful to make sure that people know that John is not the Messiah. John the Baptist was a charismatic figure in the first century. He had many followers, and he had many followers for years afterward. In fact, Josephus, in his history of the Jewish people, he writes more about John the Baptist than he does about Jesus. He mentions Jesus, but he writes more about John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a larger-than-life figure. And so the gospel writers want you to know he's not the Messiah, Jesus is. Okay, so John's not the light, but what was he doing? He was sent that he might testify about the light. So right there we have 3 times the idea of testimony. Testimonies all over John's work here. So let's take a look, okay? So to witness, to testify, to give testimony, the Greek word martyrio and the Greek word martyria, those are the 2 words for both a noun that is a witness or somebody's testimony, and a verb that means to testify. And what English word do we get out of these 2 words today? Well, we get martyr. And a martyr is someone who testifies to their faith. And very often, as we use the word martyr today, you become a martyr because you give up your life based on your testimony. And the act of being a martyr, the way we use it today, someone who dies for their faith, that's a huge testimony for others. Because they recognize, whoa, this person, the people who are seeing the martyr being put to death, kind of like the soldier at the foot of the cross, there is something that they suddenly recognize about the power of this testimony. These are the 2 Greek words that we have. Now, one way we can judge whether or not this is an actual theme in John's gospel, or are we just reading into it, is we're going to look at these two words and then see how often they're in John and compare that to the other three gospels. So let's go take a look right here. So there's our two words, martyrio, which is the verb to testify, and then martyria, the noun. That's a witness or the testimony that you're given. Okay, so Matthew, how many times do you use this word? Well, one time here and 0 here, so once. Once in the book of Matthew. Mark, how many times do you use it? Well, I don't have the verb testify at all, and then I use the noun, witness or testimony, 3 times, so a total of 3. Luke, what about you? Once for this one, once for the second one, a total of 2 times. Okay, so it's sparse. John, how about you? 33. Okay, 33 times to testify, 14 times as witness or testimony, for a total of 47 times. Can you see the difference right here? I mean, this is how you know it's a theme of John. Because in that little space of his writing, 47 times you hear those Greek words. And you understand that this is what he's talking about. Just because of that repetition. And it's huge if you are hearing those words over and over and over. And what's going to happen is, now that you know it's there, you're going to see it. You're going to see it throughout the Bible. Or, I'm sorry, throughout the book of John. Okay, now, let's go back to this testimony versus proofs. John is living in a Greek world, dominated by Greek thought, just like we are today. And the Greek mind is going to argue. They're going to argue like a scientist, right? They want proof. They want proof that the God Most High, as they call it in the Bible, is the creator of the world. They're going to want proof that Jesus is the Christ who's now ruling in the heavens. And so what John's going to do is he's going to offer testimony. And, there's a saying, comes from the Jewish rabbis, that a Greek tries to affect a man's heart through his mind. But a Jew tries to affect a man's mind through his heart. And that's the difference between the East and the West, the Greeks being in the West, the Jewish people, Israel being in the East. And that's why Jesus tells stories, right? He doesn't at all describe any or say anything about God like we would. He tells a story. And so they're storytellers, and the story itself is what grabs your soul and moves you. And then, of course, your mind will go right along with it. So when we look at, in our world that we live today, people often want some kind of proof. But proof speaks to the intellect. And so the moment you say something that's offered up as just an abstract, proof or a proof text, the Greek person who's listening to you, they're immediately going to say something like, let me think about that for a while and see if I can figure it out. It makes the mind, our intellect, and the ability of our intellect to figure things out makes it the number one resource for truth. But you take testimony, on the other hand, and a simple testimony, I was blind, but now I see. And this is personal, right? And this can reach the soul, and the soul turns the heart, right? Because if you have a heartfelt story, this is a God story, and you tell it authentically, because you have to tell it authentically. You have to be authentic. Then the soul of the other person immediately can feel it, right? And that can move the heart. Now, I can tell you that my own testimony is exactly this, right? Nobody. Now, part of the reason I can say this is because I was anti-Christian until I became a Christian at age 32. And nobody spoke smart words to me. Nobody argued with me. Nobody quoted scripture. No one called me a sinner, told me I was going to hell. None of that. What happened? There was testimony. And in this case, it wasn't so much, this is how God worked in my life. It was what I think is the most powerful testimony is the people, the Christians around me lived a different life. Those Christians had a peace that I didn't see in other people, and that was something I wanted. They were set apart from the crowd. That intrigued me, and that was the testimony itself. And that moved my heart. Now, eventually, people would speak into that, and I would realize, aha, this is exactly what I was looking for this whole time. Because, it's no guarantee, right? If you tell your story to somebody, it's not a guarantee that the person on the other side is immediately going to accept Jesus as Lord on the spot. But the thing is, they can't argue or deny your story. If you just try to offer them an abstract proof, well, they'll cast it aside. But you can't deny their story, and that's the power of your own story. And the story tends to stick with them longer than maybe a smart sentence that you came up with. And the whole time, if someone were to say to me, well, how did that work? I would simply say, I have no idea. I don't know. I just know that it did. I was this way, and the next thing you know, I wasn't any longer. Like, there's no arguing. You just offer your testimony about how God acted in my life, and that the evidence that I know, and then, God willing, because the most powerful testimony is your life, and God willing, my life will also reflect that testimony, and they will see it in a way. You will stand apart. Now, let me give you an example, because of how powerful this is. Let me give you an example from the Bible. Does the Bible show us any examples for reaching a non-believing community, meaning you live in a Greek world? They're not buying it, right? You can have discussions within the religious community that all accept the Bible, and we can have discussions of minutia, just like Paul was having with the Jewish people. They're both working from the same Bible. But if you have a Greek world that doesn't care about your Bible, how are you going to talk to them that reaches the soul? And there's a great story, and it comes from the Gospel of Mark. So I'm just going to share it very quickly. You'll have to go and read it at some point. It's in Mark chapter 5. This is the story of the crazy demon-possessed man that is across the lake. Now, this is an important thing, because when Jesus is talking with his disciples, on one side of the lake is a Jewish community. They all have the same Bible. He says, let's go across the lake to the Decapolis. The Decapolis is Greek. They don't have any of that stuff. They have all kinds of gods, but they don't have the Bible. They don't know anything about the Bible. So we actually have a couple different lessons on this, because it does take some, you have to kind of pull it apart a little bit. But for instance, in our Sea of Galilee series, part 3 is just on the first verse, Mark 5, verse 1, going across the sea, talking about why that sentence even matters. And then when you get across the sea, he's going to meet the crazy man. And it's near this city. This is an ancient city. You see that mound? It doesn't look like much because the sun was setting. But this mound right here, this is a city called Susita. Susita in Aramaic means horse or mare, and or hippos. Hippos is like a hippodrome. Hippos is, or hippopotamus. Hippos is horse in Latin, sorry. Okay, now you can see the Sea of Galilee in the background. Across the Sea of Galilee, you have the Jewish community. This, on this side right here, this is the Decapolis. These are the Greeks, the pagans. Okay? And Jesus says, let's go over there. And everyone's like, really? We got to go over there? He says, and this is so cool, there's one crazy man. In a Greek community, Greek thinking, you value people differently. If you're more attractive, you're more valuable. If you're more athletic, you're more valuable. If you got a special skill or you're smart, intelligent, you're more valuable. Everybody's assigned a value. How is that even possible? To a Jewish community? Now, of course, it seeps in because you're going to make some people more important. Jesus doesn't want you to do that. He wants you to treat all people who are made in the image of God. And so then you have a man who ends up, because of whatever pressures are happening in that community, he ends up living down in the caves or among the rocks, and he's cutting himself with stones. And he's crying out. He's clearly in mental anguish, in emotional anguish, in physical anguish. And of course, he's possessed by demons. And Jesus is going to go across the sea for one person. Okay? So here's what it says. This is starting out in verse 19, right? So what happens is Jesus goes over and heals him. And after he heals him, the man is going to plead with him, it says, to go with Jesus, right? So it says, that's Jesus, was entering the boat, as Jesus was entering the boat, the man who was possessed by demons pleaded with him that he might be with him. And you would expect, you almost want Jesus to say, yes, come with us. You kind of expect when someone wants to go follow Jesus that he would say yes to them. He doesn't always. And in this case, what does he say? He says no. Verse 19, he says, however, Jesus did not allow him. No, you're not going to come with me. But here's what I want you to go do. Go to your house, to your own people. See, it's in the Decapolis, right? It's the non-Jewish Decapolis. They're pagans. And what are you going to go do? Go tell them your story. Give your testimony. Tell them the great things that the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. And you notice what Jesus doesn't say. Go explain the covenant with Abraham. Go tell them how God spoke to Moses. Go tell them about King David or there's a coming Messiah. Doesn't say none of that. He doesn't say go offer these 25 proofs that God is real and that I'm the Messiah and all. It's just none of that stuff. Very simple. Go tell them your story. So tell them the great things the Lord has done for you. That's your story and how he had mercy on you. And this is what's so cool because he does. He goes, it says, so he went his way and he began to proclaim in the Decapolis, there's the Decapolis, how Jesus had done great things for him. And everyone was amazed. And this is what's really cool. If you're paying attention to what happens, is this man goes back to the Decapolis. He doesn't know how any of it took place. He just had a encounter with Jesus and his life changed. And so his life change itself is the testimony. He's no longer cutting himself. He's calm and in his right mind. He's not crying out in anguish. People suddenly see there's a different human being standing. That's the testimony. And what happens in Mark is the next time that Jesus steps foot in the Decapolis, a pagan region, a whole crowd came out to greet him. Now, do they know anything about systematic theology? Zero. They don't know anything about the Bible. They don't know anything about the heroes of the Bible. They don't know anything about God other than they witnessed the changed life of one individual. This is the power of testimony and why John is going to fill his gospel with this idea. So we can see there's a pattern that happens throughout John's gospel. So you notice, like right off the bat, the Bible or John told us that John the Baptist was called by God. He's sent by God. So that's who he's in connection with. But what is John called to do? Give testimony. So what does John do right off the bat? It's in chapter 1. He's going to give testimony to his disciples. And two of his disciples, it's verse 35 in chapter 1, two of his disciples leave and start following Jesus. And what are they going to do? So they have their enlightenment moment. One of those disciples is Andrew. Andrew has a brother named Peter. What are they going to do? They're going to go give their testimony. Hey, Peter, I think we found the one that Moses talked about. Or that might have been the next one. You get my point. Andrew goes down and he tells Peter. And so on, and so on, and so on. And this is what's happening, right? someone has an encounter with Jesus. That's Philip. And then Philip immediately turns around and goes and finds Nathanael and testifies. The Samaritan woman has an encounter with Jesus. The Samaritan woman by the well. What does she do? She goes into town and she tells everybody about her Jesus experience. And this is the power of testimony. No proof. You're not arguing in the Bible. Just a simple testimony of the encounter you had with God. So this tells us we have to know our story. What are your God stories? How has your life changed? Or maybe it's not the transition story, I was this way and that, but what are your stories of walking in faith where you've seen the hand of God move in your life? Things came to be that couldn't have happened any other way. We don't need more smarter, more reasoned, more logical arguments. We just need to say, you know what? Here's what happened in my life. And you allow that story then to work on the individual that you're talking to. Have a human moment. Because if it's a God story, it will hit the soul. And then, you know what you do? You release that outcome to God. Because we don't know the path that other person's on. We don't know how many people have told them stories in the past. We don't know who they're going to meet next week, next month, next year. That God is already lining up to bring someone else in their life. He brought you there to tell your story and witness to the power of God in your life. So proofs, they speak to the intellect. The mind may never make it to the heart. Testimony speaks to the soul. Once the heart's captured, the mind, it naturally goes with it. So this is a prominent theme. You'll begin to see it as you're reading through the book of John. Learn your story and share it with others. And don't worry about the outcome. God will take care of that.